Okay, let's kick off this tutorial nice and quickly. First of all, what you're going to do is take a look at your render properties. If you're currently on cycles, I would recommend, just for the sake of quickness and ease, popping yourself on EV for this tutorial. If you'd like to keep motion blur on, go for it. I'm personally going to turn it off and keep bloom and ambient and occlusion on for the time being. Next thing we're going to do is dive into our world settings. That's going to be the main driver for this whole black hole scene. So press use nodes, make sure that's blue. Go to your shading tab at the top and switch from object mode to world mode, at which point you'll get a background and a world output. The color of the background is going to be determined by a couple of things, but the main one. Okay, so for your world nodes, you want to actually bring in Shift A environment texture, pump that into the color. Make sure you open your image and that it's a high enough resolution, at which point you'll end up with this. You can pump up the strength to bring the brightness up and down, and you want the vector going into the vector, at which point you end up with a mapping that looks like this, with a little bit of a seam at the side. So what we can do from here is rotate the actual texture itself manually in this box here, if you would like, and you can also adjust the scale. I would leave it at default for the moment. What we want to be doing here is adjusting the kind of color values, how much the blacks stand out from the light colors and how much the other colors stand out from each other. So we need to do something with an RGB curve. It's not too complicated what we're going to be doing, but just rest assured, if we take a value here and bring it into sort of a curve shape, perhaps pinning it down here, you end up with a texture that is, if you go back to default, you end up with a lot more detail, but perhaps it's a bit too busy. If you bring this down, you're actually increasing the contrast and you're making the difference between the lights and darks that little bit more prominent, and you're dulling some of the other colours in the scene. But in my opinion, it brings out this black hole effect a little bit more. Again, if you need to pump up the brightness afterwards, you can do that with the background colour strength. So that is the general nodes for the world scene, which is the main source for this black hole effect in terms of background. Have a play around with the settings, make sure you're happy, and you can also look at Pexel's website for more high-res photos of space. Use anything you like. It doesn't have to be a space scene, but obviously that looks a bit better in terms of theming. So what we need to do now in this scene, if we go back to layout mode, you notice we actually don't have anything in our scene at all. So what we need to do is bring in a sphere. That's going to be the main source of our black hole. UV sphere is the main thing here. What we need to do as well is use a modifier on that to bring up the subdivisions, basically the resolution. Bring that up to 2 on both the render and the viewport and apply that. So you notice if we go into wireframe, there is suddenly a lot more resolution on this object. You also probably want to set shade smooth on that object as well. And what we've ended up with is a very nice sphere. What do we need to do in regards to the animation of the black hole? Well, down at the bottom here, I'm going to set my frames to 200 for maximum. So that's going to be an animation, bearing in mind this animation doesn't loop, an animation of 1 to 200 frames. In our first frame, our object is going to be, in our first frame, our object is going to be a size of 5 on our scale factor. So it's going to be big, and set a keyframe on the X, Y, and Z just by clicking and dragging these icons here and down on our timeline at the bottom. We now have a keyframe. Go all the way to the end of your animation, drag down and set a keyframe of 1.5. Again, I found these are the values that work for me. You can use different ones to get different effects, but that is the main driver of the changing effect of our black hole. So over time, this object shrinks. Now, you're probably asking yourself, how does this effect look so amazing if it's just a sphere? Well, the key factor for the black hole looking so good is we place a camera actually inside the object, and we have a very special setup of shaders inside the object as well, which gives it this black hole style effect. So at this moment in time, give yourself Shift A and a camera, and that camera is going to be slap bang, hopefully in the middle of our scene. So you're going to press these to 0 on the rotation, 0 those out, and at the moment just hide your sphere because we want to know where this camera is going to be. So we might want to, using our gizmos here, rotate our object on the x-axis. You can again do that on here, so you can just put 90. And we also might want to bring this out a bit, but bear in mind we want the beginning of our animation. We want the camera to be inside the object, and over the course of the animation it will be brought outside. So perhaps you want to leave the camera somewhere on 3 or maybe minus 2.5 on the Y scale, just to make sure it spends enough time in the object before it gets transferred out. You'll see what I mean if you press play on the animation. You'll notice over time the object, the camera rather, gets slowly drawn out from inside the sphere to outside. Another important thing with the camera, you really want a very low focal length, wide angle, in order to have as much of the background scenery as possible in the camera view. Again, you can press 0 on your numpad to go inside the view of your camera, and you can see how it looks. Now, what do we need to do from here? We need to do the shading of our sphere. Head over back to the shading tab, go back from world view on the left here to object, make sure your sphere is selected, press new, and that assigns a new material to our sphere. Delete the principal BSDF shader, we are not going to need it. Now, let me take you through what this whole effect is going to look like. So at the beginning we have just a black blob because there is no material. What we want to do is use something called a layer weight node. This node has two outputs. It has a facing node and it has a Fresnel node. These are driven by the angle of viewing of the object. And all you need to know is they look incredibly cool when applied inside the object. So, for instance, if we go facing, you can see that it tends to operate on, no matter the viewing angle, you get this kind of inside is dark and the outside is lighter. With the Fresnel, you end up with an outer set of shading on the outside of the object. So we're going to be using the facing for most of this. We need a value in the blend of 0.950. It needs to be quite high. So if you preview that, we have a very small black blob in the middle. What we need to do from there is color ramp it. And this is quite a common technique for increasing the contrast of your objects, just having a little bit more control. So you can see if we bring this over, we can actually increase and decrease the blending of the effect. We want this quite close to the middle on the black, and put it to ease mode to make the line between black and white quite soft compared to the harshness that it had before. We roughly want that in the middle. You can change the position value manually, 0.5 for instance, and again this just kind of clamps and changes those values as we need. We also perhaps want to have a little bit of control over this, not just with a visual factor but with also a bit of maths. So if you bring in a math node, don't worry, we're not going to do some rubbish stuff. We may need to multiply this value, for instance. That's probably a good place to start. Pump this into the bottom, and with the top you can put in something like 1.7 for instance, just to make the contrast that bit more. Again, it's another driver for how much the effect is going to be on the difference between the inner part of the black hole and the outer part. So we are actually going to be doing something a bit complicated. We're going to be mixing several shaders together with a mix shader. What this does is you can take another shader and take this shader and mix them with a certain value. That value can be 50-50, so in which case you're mixing two values equally, or you can use a driver on, well, not strictly a driver, you can use another value that you've generated on this to produce a different effect. So what we're going to be doing here in basic terms is applying a glass, the SDF, into shader number 1. Suddenly, bam, we've got this warping effect going on, which is the glass taking over. Now, what we also want is a bit of editing of the IOR, which is index of refraction. We want that to be changing over time. We don't want it uniform around the whole object, so normally it would look like this. You can keep it like that if you like, but I find you can also drive your index of refraction with the values you've generated before, which means on the inside your index of refraction is going to be 1 or close to 1, and on the outside your index of refraction is going to be 0, which just means light is going to refract heavily on the inside compared to the outside. Very, very interesting stuff. You can just preview that by pressing Shift and Control together and clicking on the particular node you'd like to preview. You can see as I'm doing that, it's changing to the surface. So we're turning this and outputting it to this, which is then being slightly modulated from here on out. Now, the factor, what I did before, because I wanted to slightly boost the way that this was going to work, I wasn't going to have anything on my second slot, so this was going to be pure black on the second shader. And I was also going to use an invert node on here, and the color is going to be driven by, again, the same mask we've used before. So you can see we've got an inverted node, which means on here, this is where the glass is going to take over, and this is where the glass isn't going to be there and where the black is. So if we pump that into our shader and tweak it, we can suddenly get a bit more contrast between, again, the inside and the outside. So after a bit of tweaking, this is what my shader looks like for the actual black hole object. We have a layer weight set to a very high blend with the facing module, and that goes into an easing based color ramp, with black being at the midpoint and white at the far right end of the scale. And that effect is multiplied slightly, and that provides an inverted version of itself to be the mask for the driver of this glass and transparent BSDF shaders mix. You can pump up the roughness of the shader if you like. I prefer to leave it at 0. And that value also drives the index of refraction, just to get a bit of variance over time. And you end up with this lovely effect. It's relatively simple. Do copy down the nodes. And also, if you do Shift and Control at the same time and click on a node, you can see the output of that node and therefore how it works. So for instance, if we look at the value that's driving the mix, we can see that on the outside, we're going to have more of the transparent shader. On the outside, we're going to have more of the glass shader, and on the inside, we're going to have the transparent shader. So this is the final effect, and if you press 0, you're going to end up looking at the object through your camera. And I think you'll agree the effect is rather effective and useful. So what you can do from here, let's take a very quick look at the render settings. What I did for my first render is I put these both at a square ratio, perfect for Instagram, TikTok, whatever you're going to be using. 1920 for both. Frame rate leave at 24. Obviously you can set this higher if you like, but that means you might need to extend the frames of your animation, and that means render times are going to be longer. Make sure you select an output folder by pressing this button here, and if you would like it as a PNG sequence that you're then going to render separately, then obviously select PNG. What I'm going to do instead is an FFmpeg video. Color management, make sure under your color management of the scene, under color management of your scene, make sure that filmic high contrast is selected. You can select other stuff, but this produces the best result. So for your rendering settings, Eevee render of 64 should be good enough for this. You can add motion blur if you require it. Make sure you select your output folder, FFmpeg, go down to encoding. MP4 is a good option here, and select your video codec if you feel like it. H.264 should be good enough. Output quality, perceptually lossless is generally a good bet with this. With the Eevee render engine, you're going to find that your rendering is rather quick, and that is good. You could also choose to do some post-processing on this if you so feel. For the camera itself, in the actual render, I did use a camera rig. I might do a video on said rig at some point, but for the time being, I will render this animation for you and show you how it looks in post. Once again, a big thank you to all my subscribers and viewers. If you did like the video, please do give it a thumbs up and a comment down in the comment section, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.